James Douglas was a major leading figure in the First Scottish War of Independence, and I would argue that his effective tactics of capturing castles and guerrilla warfare were crucial in aiding Robert the Bruce's campaign of an independent Scotland with Robert as king. James's drive to beat the English and force them out of Scotland by any means earned him the title of the Black Douglas, as he was known for attacking the English at their most vulnerable, and in the medieval world, religious holidays like Shrove Tuesday were an excellent opportunity to strike. So now, let's look at the life of James the Black Douglas. At the start of the war, James was only 10 years old, and the conflict would mould him into a cunning fighter and a master of besieging. James's father, William the Hardy Douglas, was a key figure in the early years of the war, as he had supported William Wallace's rise as a leading Scottish figurehead. But William Douglas was captured by the English in 1297 and would later die in the Tower of London. With his father's death, the Douglas estates and titles were then seized by the English crown. James was being educated in Paris in 1297 before returning to Scotland as a squire for William Lamberton. The next time James appears is during the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, where he petitioned King Edward Longshanks to return his ancestral lands. But King Edward, after being informed of who he was, reacted angrily, and James was forced to leave. James, now realising that his pledge of loyalty to King Edward was useless, probably knew that as Scotland was subdued, he could not join any factions that could gain his lands back, as there were none left in Scotland other than William Wallace. But he was on the run, as his power had significantly diminished since the Battle of Falkirk. So with no significantly powerful faction James could side with, all he could do was work as a valet for several English lords. By 1306, a faction did rise that could potentially grant James's lands back. Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale, had murdered his rival John Cummin at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, and with his main rival dead, Robert was on his way towards Glasgow when James approached Robert and told him his tale before offering his allegiance to Robert. The first years of Robert's campaign to unify Scotland under his banner were a disaster, as King Edward had ordered any who supported Robert to be branded as traitors and put to death immediately. The rules of medieval chivalry would not be applied, and James would soon discover this at the Battle of Methven in June 1306, as the Earl of Pembroke would attack King Robert's camp in the evening, nearly capturing Robert and forcing him to flee northwards. Robert would experience another defeat at the Battle of Dalry, and James was wounded in one engagement, before escaping mainland Scotland and only returning in 1307 with a small force of men-at-arms. This is when James started to develop his tactics, as limited men and resources would mean he would need to be creative in attacking fortifications and any English troops. While King Robert was fighting in the north of Scotland, he stationed James in the south, where James set a base in Selkirk Forest, in a similar move William Wallace had done a few years prior. From there, James could orchestrate raids and create traps to sap the English of men and resources. One notable example is that James managed to kill the Earl of Pembroke's destrier, which cost the Earl £65, roughly worth £46,000 in today's money. James also managed to convince a few powerful Scottish lords to support King Robert's cause. One of the most prominent was Alexander Stewart, as James had managed to capture him from an English garrison. By April 1307, James had made plans to recapture his family's castle, but as he lacked the men and the siege equipment needed to retake the castle, he devised a plan to wait for Palm Sunday, when the garrison would be occupied with prayers and celebrations. But first he convinced a former servant still working in the castle to relay his plan to the local men in order to wait until the garrison were attending the church service. On the 7th of April, while the garrison were attending a service, James and a few of his men waited outside the church for an opportune moment before striking and killing most of the garrison. From there, James and his men feasted on what would have been the garrison's meal before taking what supplies they could and destroying the rest. But before leaving, they concocted a grim sight for the English when they returned for the castle. The Scots' cause would also be boosted with the death of King Edward I in 1307. For the next 7 years, James would participate in many raids and battles and cause Edward II such grief and financial hardship that even with a large army at his back, Edward could not find James or King Robert's forces. And in 1310, in a campaign that frustrated Edward so much that he wrote to the Pope to complain about the Scots' lack of eagerness to meet on an open battlefield and described them as foxes. By the year 1314, most of Scotland was back in Scottish hands, as James's prowess in capturing garrisons and castles was now legendary, and one of the most famous of these captures was Roxburgh Castle on Shrove Tuesday, the 19th of February 1314. As James had instructed his men to cover themselves in black and crawl slowly towards the castle on their hands and knees at night in order to deceive the garrison into thinking they were a herd of cattle grazing near the castle. The garrison were caught completely by surprise. The only part of the castle that put up any defence was in the main tower of the castle, but that was soon captured. The castle was razed to the ground, preventing any recapture. James would gain further renown later in the year at the Battle of Bannockburn, as on the first day of fighting, James had aided Thomas Randolph Skiltrum that was fighting in the open fields against a detachment of heavy English cavalry. And then, on the second day, James's own Skiltrum drove the furthest into the English line, and with the support of King Robert's troops, their drive became the centre of the English rout. King Edward had been dragged from the field by his entourage, numbering a 500 royal escort, and they soon started to escape towards the safety of England. James asked permission from King Robert to chase the royal escort, and with Robert's blessing, James with 60 mounted men chased after King Edward, as his capture could potentially end the war there and then. Although outnumbered by the royal entourage, this didn't stop James and his fellow Scots from harassing the fleeing English as much as they could, James only stopping when Edward reached the safety of Berwick. Now with the English on the back foot, the north of England was open to raids from the Scots, and James would lead many of these raids. The choice was simple: pay the Scots a tribute of money, trinkets or cattle, or flee for your life.